Hello there, YouTube.
Hello, Kevin.
And welcome to the very first episode of What Sargon of Akkad Got Wrong Now?
Opening credits! Oh, wait. There are no credits. Well, what has Sargon got wrong this time?
A new series which exposes the fibs, fallacies, falsehoods and fabrications spewed forth, vomited onto the internet by the stripped gears of the mind of the YouTube user known as Sargon of Akkad.
Well, I do guess the clue was in the title, Kevin.
Now, this series was inspired by the many requests I'd had to give Sargon his own episode of The Descent of Man, O Sphere.
Surely, the decline of the man, O Sphere, makes more sense. Because that's grammatically correct English. Do you speak it?
Which is another series that I do, and I'll leave a link to the playlist for that series below, in which I expose individuals from the manosphere for the pricks that they are.
Sexually offensive language, triggered!
And while Sargon is an absolutely worthy candidate for induction into that particular Hall of Shame, I just cannot be bothered with him. He's just too much of a fucking prick for me to sit there and go through all of his fucking mental diarrhea.
Another one! Triggered!
In such a condensed short space of time, which is what I have to do for that series. And I'd have to go through his back catalogue and all the rest of it. It's too much. It would have driven me fucking mad. So instead of doing one big video like that about him, I'm going to be performing regular educational enemas on Sargon, which are very much needed because he's so full of shit.
Of course. You are the expert after all. I mean, you do have...
I have a degree in history on... Now, like my other series, it will be on a regular, irregular schedule, by which I mean they'll be coming out every so often, but there won't be like one every Wednesday or something like that. But as and when the fancy takes me, I will be dealing with one of Sargon's freshly crimped off lies and exposing him for the utter bullshit merchant that he is.
Sargon is a bullshit merchant. Yeah, this is the same guy that accuses him of doing conspiracy bullshit when it comes to feminism and games and, you know, what is subject of choice. Yeah, accuses him of being a fraud. You know, just take a look at their conversation. He accuses Sargon of being a right winger pretending to be a left winger. Yeah, accuses him of being a conspiratorial nut. Yeah, that's not conspiratorial, but that's not to do with this video. But let's just be aware that there's a bit of projection going on when he's talking about bullshit merchant. Which, by the way, his argument in this video is kind of bullshit merchanting, if that's even a word. But let's just let him carry on, and I will refute his points.
So, with the opening formalities dealt with, take it away, Sargon, you twat.
They claim to be apolitical, yet in the same breath refuse to acknowledge the politics behind these games. Well, to them, there are no politics in being white. There are no politics in being brown. These things are not political. But to the people writing these articles, they absolutely are. They cling to the notion that women didn't fight in the Middle Ages, fiercely stating this as fact. Well, it's not that they need to fiercely state it as fact, it's that essentially it was fact.
Oh, really? Because I call bullshit.
Now, you see, the clue in that statement is essentially, Kevin, but I'll get into that later. I'll get into that more fully. But I think you need to realise that he didn't say that they did not fight, period. They just essentially did not fight, which means that they did fight, but not as much. But I'm not going to repeat myself because I will get into that further as you discuss that point.
Now, before we get going, I'd like to point out, as indeed Sargon went on to point out in the video itself, that the majority of people in the army during the Middle Ages were, of course, men. But Sargon way overstates the point.
No, he doesn't. Women were like a very, very, very small minority of any army in any period of the medieval era. I mean, it was almost entirely men. Most of the wars, most of the armies were all entirely fought by men. Of course, there were, in some cases, women that led armies or behind the scenes arranged armies to fight, usually using generals to fight on their behalf. So, I guess you are right in a sense that women did fight or were involved in war, but as you go on to argue, it's not to the extent that you think it is.
And basically states that women were a negligible part of the armed services at the time.
They were. I'm sorry, that's not sexist, that is fact. You are an historian. Sorely you know that in the medieval era, there were very few, if any, female combatants. When there were female combatants, it will often be as a last resort, but you know what? We'll get to that. I don't want to show all my arguments too early, after all, but they were negligible. That's not sexism. That's not belittling women's contributions to war. They were. I mean, there's nothing wrong about that. Men are, and I hate to say it, we are considered the more disposable sex because we are physically stronger, biologically speaking, and when it comes to medieval warfare, stamina, endurance, and strength are incredibly important, and women just don't have that as much as we do. Plus, they're far more important alive than dead. No, they need to do all the jobs that men do when the men go off to war. They need to, after the war, they need to be mothers and raise children to replenish the losses if it was a particularly costly war back then, because even though war was everywhere and it was probably one of the most warlike periods in our history, battles were kind of few and far between, mainly due to the fact that population numbers were very small compared to now, and just the travel restrictions. It's not like now you can send a helicopter full of Marines into a combat zone. Back then you had to actually march down roads which in the winter would become quagmires. So a very, very, very costly war on the scale of, say, I don't know, World War One. I don't want to exaggerate too much. Would be very rare, but even back then, because due to the small amount of populations, the populations being very small, therefore a huge battle could be costly to the male population. Like in Agincourt, the flower of the French nobility was destroyed. Not all of them were killed, obviously, but a fair chunk of them. Speaking of the 100 Years' War, we'll be getting into that shortly.
Which is fucking bollocks. What he also doesn't say is why that is the case, because that would mean him having to admit to the dreaded P word, patriarchy.
What? In many ways, it kind of was patriarchy. Very, very few women rose up into the highest power. But then again, it's common sense for that time, isn't it? It's common sense that you take the men to fight the wars, not the women, because as I already mentioned, they're worth a hell of a lot more alive because they can give life as well as take it. They can do the jobs that men do when most of them leave to fight. There'll be very few men left behind. Most of them will be old or young, and token defence forces.
Yes, because in most of the world, during the Middle Ages, women were severely hampered from serving in the military due to the patriarchal nature of the societies in which they lived.
Now, this point I take issue with, because, as you can clearly see, in his examples, these women were not hampered by the patriarchal society in which they lived in. In many ways, well, in this particular way, I'm not going to say in many ways it's similar, but in this way it is similar to our society in the sense that if you're good enough, you can rise up and take power, or take a good position, or be elected, or given a responsibility based on your skills and how good you are at a job. Bear in mind, England, not the UK, England at this point, had a civil war between Stephen and Queen, and was she a queen or princess? I think she was the queen. Queen Matilda, over who had the right to rule. Now, I'm trying to remember if she was a princess or queen or not. I think she was definitely a queen. But she thought that she had the right to rule, while he thought he had the right to rule because of Plantagenet family stuff. And I'm being terrible about this because it's been a long time since I've read about that particular part of English history. But she had a huge following. She had the King of Scotland coming down south to invade England, so he could help her claim, because they were related. I think they were cousins or maybe sister and brother-in-law, something like that. And she had a huge following. It wasn't just Stephen, even though ultimately he became king. Afterwards, a compromise was set in which Edward I would become his successor, although she wanted to be his puppet. Now that's this example of a woman who rose up not just because of her familial ties, but because she was clearly a strong and competent leader that people could believe in. And the same can be said for all these female figures that Kevin, is about to give us. But bear in mind, unlike Matilda, a lot of these women were raised in positions of power because there simply probably wasn't enough men to do the job, or not good enough men to do the job. So they were a last-ditch effort on the powers that be's part, because, you know, who's going to lead our armies? Who's got any good ideas? So it's not necessarily patriarchy stopping women from doing it. It's just that, as a rule, women don't do it unless the situation calls for it, or they've risen through merit. So he's trying to suggest that women were completely hampered, when really, in medieval society, it was incredibly structured and very, very class-based as well as gender-based. I mean, you had different modes of dress, not only with, you know, peasants, yeomans, who are basically the middle class, and lords, but gentiles and Jews dressed differently in society, so you could know who you are and who another person is. So it's kind of a weak argument to suggest it was entirely patriarchy, because then the patriarchy has given these women the chance to fight for their countries. I don't think he quite gets that contradiction there, does he?
Because if Sargon ever admitted to the P word, his rabble of cretinous simpletons would lose their little man-boners and might stop giving him all that money. Aww.
I sense a disturbance in the force. I think you call that jealousy. Aww.
But anyway, on with the history ponage.
Let's do this.
Now, I've left a load of links down below in the description box to sources for all of this material, and also a link to a fantastic episode of the Medieval Archives podcast, which deals with this particular topic in general, which you should all definitely go and listen to. Go and check that podcast out, it's wonderful. In one of those links there is a great long list of female warriors from the Middle Ages, and I'm just going to read to you a few choice cuts from that list.
So he basically trying to use individual examples in order to prove that what is essentially an exception to the rule is actually the norm. That's not going to help, Logan.
In 783, Saxon women threw themselves bare-chested into battle against Charlemagne.
Now, the Saxons weren't doing this through choice. It's not that they wanted to use these women, it's because they had no choice. Charlemagne had waged a very horrible war against them and already murdered 4,500 of them.
In 971, the victorious Byzantines discovered what they called shield maidens among the fallen Norse warriors.
Again, this is another example of a side that is losing using women to try and win the battle. The Vikings were losing, the Byzantines were not. But there were no women in the Byzantine army, but that was been because of patriarchy then, wasn't it?
From 1131 to 1160, Melisende of Jerusalem fought in the Second Crusade.
She did not fight in the crusade, she appointed generals to fight in her place, as you can see here.
And rather beautifully, in the 1400s, there was a case of reverse white knighting, basically, where Isabella, the Duchess of Lorraine, which is in modern-day France, led an army to rescue her husband from the Duke of Burgundy.
That's true, but again, this is an exception to the rule, and it doesn't prove your point. It does not prove that women's contribution to war in the medieval era is more than negligible. It just doesn't. You need to give me more proof than that. You need to have a more substantial argument.
And of course, Sargon, there is this woman. Yes, arguably the most famous human being, male or female, of the medieval period, Joan of Arc.
She's only really, really famous in England and France. And by the way, do you remember last time when I talked about the 100 Years' War and the French, or rather, as an example, people, a whole kingdom being helpless and not knowing who to turn to? They turn to a woman called Joan of Arc. She's the only one who has any kind of idea on how to fight. That's what I'm talking about. The French were getting their ass kicked by the English. The English, since Henry V, have been making huge gains against the French. They'd almost pretty much got the throne of France in an agreement, and they were just basically conquering whatever they felt like. I guess I'm kind of oversimplifying it and probably not giving it justice, but remember, the French were on the losing side. They'd lost most of the nobles in Agincourt alone. The ones who should have been leading the fight against the English, who were in many ways weakened because Henry V was dead. And Joan of Arc was the only person they could turn to. Now, she wasn't the only person leading French armies, and ultimately she paid the price for that. But so what? It still doesn't prove your point. It's Joan of Arc. Doesn't prove that she was more than an exception to the rule, that women's contribution to war was not negligible. She just doesn't. And the majority of the French army were still male. Sorry, hate to break it to you.
The female warrior who led the French fucking army, for Christ's sake, Sargon. Jesus Christ, man, do you know anything?
Well, yeah, he knows the facts. And he knows not to commit the mistake that you are about to make.
Now anyway, let's have a look at a few contemporary medieval images, shall we? Now this first image is an absolutely perfect example of why Sargon is completely fucking wrong. Now this one is taken from the Smithfield Decretals manuscript from 1230, and it's a picture of a castle being defended solely by women. Because during the Middle Ages, when men were off fighting in wars abroad, for instance in the Crusades, women would be left to defend castles, towns, cities, villages, hamlets, whatever. So it was very common to see women engaging in military battle. And in this image you can see the castle being defended solely by women. The face at the window is thought to be that of a male child, so the only grown adult male in the image is the one having his fucking head cut in two by the sword of a woman, Sargon. So contrary to your assertion, women were actually tearing it up during the Middle Ages, you ignorant twat.
Now this is a cardinal sin. Remember, he has I
have a degree in history on...
So they must have taught him, not just in university, but in school and in college, that you never, ever take a source at face value, especially medieval texts and pictures. Because what you might find is not what you might necessarily see. This picture is not even what it's depicting. Yes, women did fight in sieges, or at least helped out in sieges, but that was only as a last resort. In fact, it's not particularly right to say that all men went off to fight. There were, in many cases, as I mentioned before, older men and younger men and boys, those who were too young or too old to fight on campaign, would stay behind. And there would also be a token force. They, like a militia or someone, a noble is entrusted to guard the country when the king is away with the best warriors off on campaign. He will have a token force in which to protect the country, because England had many wars with the French and the Scots at exactly the same time. That's not necessarily the 100 Years' War, it's through other wars as well. You have to protect your borders in case something happens, because you are weakened because all your best troops are elsewhere, which means you're vulnerable to attack. But I digress, that's a digression. This picture is actually a parody of the popular medieval motif of the Castle of Love. It was parodied throughout the era. See, without its proper context, you're making it look like something that it isn't. And bear in mind, you can easily replace these women, you can replace them with animals even. I mean, in fact, there were pictures of them with cats and foxes and apes. It's a parody, okay? It's not proof at all that women fought in sieges and that they were tearing it up, Kevin. Come on! You must have known that this was a parody. You are, as you say, an historian. Or it's a qualified one. And you know where this comes from. So how can you sit there and tell us that that is proof that women fought in battle or did not have a negligible part in war? In fact, they had a much bigger part in war. I don't think you're being disingenuous. I'd hope you're not. Because I don't think someone who has a degree in history would do that. I think you genuinely didn't know that is a parody of the Castle of Love. This is why context is important, why you should never ever take a medieval picture or a text in face value. You just can't take it at face value.
In this image we see a female knight on a black horse, and this one is taken from the Capodalista Index of 1458, which was a contemporary series of illustrations from the city of Padua, which is in the modern day nation of Italy.
A much stronger example compared to the Castle of Love, but it still doesn't prove anything. She's just a woman in armour. It doesn't really prove she's a soldier or not. I mean, there were loads of lords who loved to make themselves look out to be soldiers when probably they had a problem which made them not be able to fight, or they didn't fight very often. You know, a lot of these medieval texts and art are very symbolic. This might not necessarily be a literal female warrior. It could be that she is like a warrior. She is of a status, or metaphorically as an, I don't know, take your pick, temper, resolve, anything really. Or it could be that she's rich and wants to look powerful, or she is, say, the head of the family, you know? Who knows? We don't know.
And this one is again another medieval illustration of battle, with the figures on the left clearly being women, and the two figures in the foreground being those of women who are either dying or dead in military battle, Sargon.
That is in fact a depiction of the Greek myth of the Amazons. By the way, links are in the description below of all my sources, so if you want to check them out, please check them out. See, in the medieval era, I'm sorry to say, Kevin, when they depicted Greek myth, they didn't depict the Greeks as they would have looked like, as hoplites. They depicted them as, well, let's just say it, as knights. And I'll show you now what I mean. Now, the reason why they did that is because they didn't know what the Greeks actually looked like back then. Not like we do. They were ignorant of the facts. Very familiar story here, ignorant of the facts. Now,
this is an image of Qawla bint al-Azwar, and I apologise for the almost certain mispronunciation of that. Now, she was an early medieval Arabian warrior, and she led a troop of women, most notably against the Byzantine army at the Battle of Yarmouk in 636.
An actual female warrior. Well done. Best example yet. Still doesn't prove your point.
Now, this is another warrior princess, but this time from Western Europe. She is Isabel of Conches, which is in the modern day nation of France, and she is seen on the left there wielding her sword in battle.
Another one with issues. You're taking it at face value, which you shouldn't be doing. Is she really fighting or being a warrior? Because she's not wearing any armour. She's wearing her normal civilian clothes. Now, if she was fighting, she wouldn't be doing that now, would she? Now, as Sargon said in his reply, it could well have been symbolic. Or, from the quote he read out, it could very well have been from that battle where the women help the men, not through fighting, but through passing equipment and water and food to the warriors during the siege. Bear in mind, the Turks had no qualms in shooting at them. Doesn't prove your point.
Now this image is yet another example of just how wrong Sargon is. Because as you can see on the left there's a woman engaging in jousting. Now contrary to the modern image we have of jousting, it wasn't just an event at medieval games. It was actually a very brutal form of military training, intended to simulate a cavalry charge. And as this image shows, women were clearly undergoing such training during the Middle Ages. So
again, Kevin, you keep making this cardinal sin. It's been a hat trick of errors now. Look at the picture. She's wearing her nightie with some kind of cotton bud with pantaloons on her head, fighting a guy. Bear in mind, he doesn't have a weapon. He's got his hand empty, like that. How is that jousting? It's not representative of reality in any shape or form. And by the look of it, it looks like it could be a part of a heraldic symbol of some kind. It's got the whole ribbon kind of thing. I don't know. But I do know that that's not jousting. It is a kind of jousting that is not of this reality. It could be another parody, or it could be symbolic. Jesus Christ.
Now these next two images are fine examples of medieval body armour that are on display at American museums. And I specifically want you to take notice of the chest bulges, which have been placed there specifically to accommodate the female warrior's breasts. Or would Sargon suggest that maybe they were made for extremely fat medieval knights with man tits?
Oh my god, I think you've literally just jumped the shark with these examples. Look, this is an example of late medieval armour. And during that time, technology advanced to the point where they now knew in the physics of how to deflect blows of a weapon and thrusts and arrows. It's curved like that for a reason. Not because the guy has a huge man tits, like you and Sargon, or because the woman has a breast. In fact, you'll be sad to know that those are actually made for men. There are contours because it's meant to stop a weapon. Have you noticed the design on a T-34 tank and later German Panzers? The armour is contoured. All tanks are like this. The armour is contoured and kind of jagged and curved because it deflects weaponry better than it would if it was just straight. That's why it's not to accommodate breasts. And how can women have such big breasts in order to fit in that kind of armour? I mean, I understand you think the women. Men weren't very tall back then. But again, don't take it at face value. Jesus Christ, you seem to think you know an awful lot about knights and the medieval history, yet you seem to be utterly clueless. That is how you defend yourself from weapons.
And there are many other examples of this kind of medieval body armour, which suggests that women were not an insignificant part of the military during the Middle Ages.
Everything you've just said then, which has nothing to do with perhaps my poor editing, has been made redundant with some basic military history facts.
Now it's worth pointing out that any of those pieces of evidence individually don't make up a compelling case for the role of women in the military during the Middle Ages. Because, say, with the contemporary images from the medieval period, they were often idealised versions of actual events.
So you are aware of the problems, but you still go ahead and use them for your argument anyway. At least you admitted it.
So they're not 100% accurate, but put all of those pieces of evidence together and you have an absolutely rock-solid case for a pattern of female involvement in the military during the medieval period.
It doesn't even create a pattern. It doesn't have the foundations to create a pattern. If it did have the foundations, they'd be made of sand.
So running contrary to Sargon's argument, clearly women were not an insignificant part of the military during the Middle Ages.
Most of your examples have proved the opposite of your argument. In fact, they've done nothing but strengthen Sargon's argument. I'm sorry, Kevin, but grouping them all together does not change the facts of what is real and what is in your head. Women's role was negligible, and it wasn't necessarily because of patriarchy. It was through other means as well. It's just the facts, man. You just can't argue the other end. You are wrong. You're just wrong.
So, with that in mind, I've got one question for you, Sargon.
Who's your daddy?
This fucking guy is. Now, fuck off.
See, you're so ignorant of the facts that you think you know the facts. You're so not misinformed. You are misinformed. So, take a parting word from me. Fuck off! And there we have it, people. My reply video is done. This has been Charming Man 93. Like and share the video, subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you later. Remember, you gotta get to 100 if you want to see the other one.